Hi, I'm Josh Corman. I'm the founder of I Am the Cavalry.org, and you're listening to Firewalls Don't Stop Dragons.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Firewalls Don't Stop Dragons. I'm your host, Kerry Parker. Today we have episode 332 for July 10th, 2023. And I've got a really great interview for you today. We brought Josh Corman back. We talked to him last fall about some cybersecurity stuff. And at the time, he was talking about a upcoming White House cybersecurity strategy document that had not yet been released. And so we couldn't discuss it fully, but that has since been made public. And I wanted to bring him back to talk about it. So this actually happened a couple months ago. This interview has been kind of in the can for a little while, but it's a really interesting interview. And we get into some kind of heavy policy stuff. And I know that might turn you off if you're not a policy wonk, a DC policy wonk. But this is really important stuff. And this is kind of how our government helps to make life better for us. And I think that they are doing some really admirable things. There's a lot of moving parts. Our U.S. government is full of red tape and lots of bureaucracy, but they are making progress with this stuff. And it's really good to see that. And this White House strategy document is kind of the thing that kind of kicks everything off and serves as a template or an umbrella or maybe a mission statement kind of thing. But anyway, we're going to get into all that with Josh. Real quick, I know that Meta just launched Threads. I know that a lot of people are signing up for that. If you've got an Instagram account, they've been pushing it, I'm sure. There's a lot of really weird stuff going on with that. There's some dark patterns and a lot of data mining going on. I'll talk about all that next week. But for now, let me quickly set up this interview. First and foremost, it's really just painfully obvious that Josh really, truly, deeply cares about these issues. He's very emotionally invested in this stuff. And that's one of the reasons I love talking to him about it, because he really does care about these things. And a lot of the things that he is a champion of are things with serious impacts, like life or death, literally life or death. But those same kind of principles can be applied to less critical things, but still really important things. And a lot of these principles are folded into this new White House cybersecurity strategy document. And it just sets the tone for implementing these things and getting to a much better place in terms of cybersecurity. And as we're going to learn, it's not just about making things more safe. In a lot of cases, it's about making things less complex. It's about removing things that are unnecessary so that we don't have to worry about them from a cybersecurity standpoint, or getting them off the internet if they don't need to be connected to the internet, things like that. Very practical, very straightforward methodologies and approaches that make a whole lot of sense. And yet, in practice, they can take a long time to implement. One thing that Josh does throw around a couple times, he talks about this term, least cost avoider. Sometimes it's referred to in economics as cheapest cost avoider, or in tort law. I'm not sure exactly where this originated. But basically the idea is that, when accidents can be avoided by either of two parties, that it's mostly obvious that you want to place the liability on the least cost avoider, or in other words, the party who could have prevented the accident at the lowest cost. So in that sense, it's sort of a macroeconomic policy, I think, that, informs things like tort law and, of course, potential regulations. So anyway, that's why that comes into play. I think that's all I really need to talk about beforehand, so let's get right to our interview with Josh Corman. Josh Corman is VP of Cyber Safety Strategy at Clarity, founder of I Am the Cavalry, and formerly served as the Chief Strategist of CISA regarding COVID, healthcare, and public safety, among several other key positions. Welcome back to the show, Josh.
Good to be back.
Last time you were here, we were hinting at a forthcoming strategy document that you could talk a little bit about, but it wasn't yet published, and that document finally dropped in March. And so that was something you were working on, obviously at CISA, or work with people that were working on at least. And so I'd like to talk about that today. The document really isn't that long. I actually read through almost all of it. I got a little bit dry, but it's about 40 pages long, covers a lot of ground, which of course is good and bad. On the one hand, that means it's got a lot of great ideas. On the other hand, it means there's a lot of stuff that maybe we're not doing that we should be doing. I don't know if there's a lot of stuff in there. So let's start. Could you just give us a 30,000 foot view of this new policy document? What's in there with the audience? What's the purpose?
Okay. Well, I did put some thoughts to pen and paper, or at least, I wrote a blog called Consequential Cybersecurity on the Clarity blog to help people understand at least the hot take on this. And to clarify, I didn't really work on this whilst at CISA. I ended my CISA Emergency Federal Service in January of 2021. I spent a very long time after that intense, task force work, looking at what worked, what didn't work, why didn't it work, how can the country be better poised for the next crisis. And there's significant problems in the overall strategy and framing of designated critical infrastructure, interagency collaboration, who owns what. We were having the rise of the new Office of National Cyber Directorate. So I tried to metabolize a lot of my frustration and successes and failures into some constructive frameworks. And I have very recently started sharing them publicly. But over the first several months after I left CISA, I started sharing these Socratically with CISA, with White House Office of National Cyber Director at the ONCD, the newest part of the White House, put into law January 2021, and now staffed. Work with the National Security Council, which is a longer standing part, the NSC. We should talk about the dynamic between those two at some point, if you remind me, because they're in the forming, storming, norming, performing stages of their evolution. And so there were several things happening concurrently. One is, generally speaking, White Houses should probably have a strategy for cybersecurity, especially in a increasingly connected world. And it had been a while since we'd seen one. Two, my lessons learned from the Cisco task force and from the successes and failures of the government to do its job, and the public-private partnerships are coming undone, have encouraged a at least refresh, but now rewrite of a pretty substantive document from the Obama administration called PPD 21, or Presidential Policy Directive 21. That is going to be in the pantheon of mix here. But that is what established 16 designated critical infrastructure sectors. The idea that each one has a federal custodian, it used to be called an SSA, or Sector Specific Agency. Now it's called an SRMA, or Sector Risk Management Agency. And those are the public half of what you've heard called the public-private partnership, which is usually a thought-terminating cliche, a bunch of hand-waving, but that is being tested right now. And you probably know pieces of that mix in the private sector. There's usually a sector coordinating council, or an STC. There's usually an ISAC, or an information sharing and analysis center, that does the technical operations. I basically made a Schoolhouse Rock set of pictures.
Awesome.
Where we were, why it doesn't work anymore, if it ever did, what has to change, and how risk is really manifested, and how we have the haves and the have-nots, and most of the participation in public-private partnerships are the haves, not the have-nots, and 85% of the owners and operators are have-nots, and all these things I call target-rich cyber poor. So we can do a lot of that, but I'm kind of casting a wide net to come back to your question here, which is the White House National Cybersecurity Strategy is something that should come out pretty often. This one was harder than most because we learned a lot, and because PPD 21 is too long in the tooth, and because we saw where private goods trumped public goods, like Colonial Pipeline. Should I do what's right for my shareholders or for the Eastern Seaboard? Like hospitals, what's right for our data breach fines and ransoms versus what's right for public safety, degraded, delayed access to patient care. And generally what I was saying to the White House post CISA, clearly I briefed them while I was at CISA, but my real full-throated calls for substantive change, which were heard, so it wasn't just me, but I guarantee you I was an outsized voice in some of these discussions. By the way, I also took these models to Congress, right? Bipartisan committees of jurisdiction, House and Senate, for the different aspects of this. And I think everybody kind of can tell it's not working, right? And so what you had was a series of drafts. Some pieces of these drafts did not survive contact with the agency process, and other goals and deputies and principals, and eventually signed off by the president. But this is a very foundational declaration that this is what's important to this administration at this point in history for this executive branch. And within that, many of the other parallel movements need to harmonize with it. And more beyond what I just said, cybersecurity still, knock on wood, remains a fairly nonpartisan or bipartisan issue so far. I think that is ending soon, but not yet.
Really?
I can feel where the schisms will manifest, but not yet. And so we have a window with which to make some substantive change. And I experienced some of this bipartisan, bicameral support in December when the Patch Act passed the law in the omnibus. I mean, I've been working on the bones of that thing for almost exactly 9 years from the first time I audited it until it passed in the law. But this was minimum mandatory seatbelt laws for medical devices, basically. It's the Ralph Nader seatbelt laws for, and there's a bunch of stuff in it, but it granted explicit statutory authority in federal law for the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, Centers for Disease and Radiological Health to have mandatory minimum cyber hygiene for pre-market approval, post-market surveillance, 510K submissions. But like, you need to have minimum defensibility and hygiene in medical devices now. And that was bipartisan. The lobbyists tried really hard, spent a lot of money to try to kill it. And Congress said, we're in a new place now. This is affecting patient care, patient outcomes, loss of life. We have a job to do to protect the public good. We're going to do it. I know you don't like it. Tough. So that, to me, was the canary in the coal mine. There's new political will. And I honestly, I don't know if they'd ever admit this, but I honestly believe that the White House stood their ground on some of the more controversial items that did make the final cut, in part because they saw that demonstration of unity on the part of Congress in December.
Okay.
Because there's a lot of horse trading and fighting over should and shouldn't stay. And I saw through table reads, different drafts, and I saw which ones got watered down, which things stayed pretty strong. So I answered, I maybe even blunted several of your questions, but I guess if I were to try to TLDR this thing, it's appropriate for any White House to publish their strategic intent, followed up by, which both articulates what's in flight and telegraphs what's coming and where they're going to put their pressure and their budget. It's usually followed by implementation documents, plural, for certain aspects of this. A lot of people complain that there's no implementation in here. That's by design. That's what these things do. But this one, I think, is more important than prior ones for some of the content reasons, but also some of the moment in history reasons. And the other changes that are flanking it, such as the PPD 21 rewrite. Like, it's not going to be a light touch anymore. It's going to be a heavy red pen kind of a thing, which then cascades to something called the National Cyber Incident Response Plan, which is how the federal government handles national level issues and other things too. National Infrastructure Protection Plan, things like that. So there's a whole cascade of things that will flow from this. And since ONCD, which is the primary author of this, the Office of National Cyber Director, is a now permanent institution in the White House. We never had a permanent guarantee of any cyber in the White House, say. The career staff will have continuity of service irrespective of who the next federal presidents are. Right. So part of the reason, though, the Cyberspace Alarm Commission in Congress and Langevin's leadership prior to retirement to establish the Office of the National Cyber Director was so that we could have more continuity of care and long view in the White House, as opposed to whatever the president did or didn't want and how important they were or were not. So I said a lot of stuff there, maybe ruined and blunted some of your questions, but I do think this is a significant document given the context and history and flow of recognizing the importance of cybersecurity for national security, critical infrastructure, and the like. I also think it's the first one written by and will be executed by a more lasting institution of Office of National Cyber Director. And I think some of the content, pillars 1 and 3, are doozies. And I'm sure we're going to talk about how the content is materially different than previous manifestations of these. So, yeah, they're listening, and there's still a lot of fighting behind the scenes. Boys are fighting behind the scenes, but they're listening, and there's more to come.
All right, so you mentioned the pillars, and there were just real quickly, there were 5 of them. The first one was defend critical infrastructure. The second was disrupt and dismantle threat actors. The third was shape market forces to drive security and resilience. The fourth was invest in a resilient future. And the fifth was forge international partnerships to pursue shared goals. You said that this superseded the PP. I already forgotten it.
PPD 21?
Yes, it just, it doesn't stick in the brain.
Presidential Policy Directive is a PPD. Yeah.
Okay.
Number 21.
What were some of the more important or maybe novel things that were in this document that weren't in the previous ones? Does this document represent any major shifts in policy?
Sure. I guess I think you even asked this, but at the 30,000 foot level, it's not novel to have one from a president. There was one in the first year of the Trump administration. I remember some lines in that I was quite fond of. There was one in Obama administration. In fact, the Obama administration also called for, you may recall, a bipartisan commission on enhancing national cybersecurity, sometimes called the Donlin Commission. But it was, I testified to that commission as well. So I think the U.S. has been trying to figure out its cyber posture and policy and footing. But, even as far back as Richard A. Clarke being a cyber czar, or Melissa Hathaway, like we Mike Daniels after them, we've had cyber leadership. It's just how empowered they are and how much control and budget they have is varied. So this is the next one. I think how this one's different than the prior ones is a lot of the focus in the past had been on what is the executive branch doing to protect its own networks. This started front and center squarely. Critical infrastructure is the most critical thing. So that looked outward from the internal agencies towards privately owned and operated providers of critical infrastructure. So this is not superseded by PPD 21. It's just that because the very first out of the gate hard hitting is we have got to protect critical infrastructure resilience. People need water. And why? One of the things I said during and after CISA was, if you look, even though I went in to protect hospitals and vaccine supply chains ostensibly, we ended up doing quite a bit of all hazards strains on most lifeline, life safety, critical infrastructure. We had successful cyber disruption of the water you drink, the food you put on your table, the oil and gas pipelines that fuel our cars, homes, and supply chain, the schools your kids attend, municipalities who run towns and cities, federal agencies charged with state secrets, right, and national security. And what I cared the most about, timely access to patient care with now proven mortal consequences. Stuff's on fire. You do not mess with Maslow's base of the pyramid, right? Food, shelter, safety disruptions. You're not going to be inventing the next iPhone or writing poetry or sonnets if you want for food, shelter, safety, security. So like the ability for the public to trust their governments to govern, the permission to do so is safe, resilient drinking water, electricity, heat in the winter, cool in the summer, timely access to patient care. We are messing with Maslow. So this gets people's attention. And this has really been, I think the overall theme of all 5 pillars is, hey, voluntary cybersecurity has been the dominant model since President Obama's executive order that led to the NIST cybersecurity framework. There was a House bill, bipartisan House bill, there's a bipartisan Senate bill, and both got completely shut down by instead a crowdsourced NIST cybersecurity framework that was voluntary. We've had a 10-year voluntary model, and one of the key first recognition points in this strategy is voluntary only takes you so far. Free market forces only take you so far. There is a time and a place to use public good and public power and regulatory power. That time is now, and we're not going to shy from using it. We're going to use light touch, but no lighter than required to deserve and maintain the trust of the public for these lifeline things. So I think point 1 is critical infrastructure is front and center.
Well, and so that leads to my next question is how much, these are all grand ideas, and I agree with most of what's in there, I think, actually. But how much of this can they actually implement on their own? Like, how much of this can be done under the current auspices of whatever authorities that are already there with the funding that's already there? Because that's another thing that's often lacking is you've got the authority, but you don't have the funding.
Yep.
How many things can actually be done existingly? And how much of this are we going to have to still go to get congressional approval or create new agencies or add authorities to agencies that exist so that these things can actually be regulated and forced upon the people who don't want to do them?
Yeah, I know you're a software guy, so I'm not sure this term is even used anymore, but you remember the old term Horizon 1, 2, 3, right? Like, what can you do right now? What can you do in the next, 6 to 18 months? What can you do past that? They're doing all 3. So within Pillar 1, I know we're going to bounce around on these pillars, but within Pillar 1, the direction from the White House, and this even came from the NSC, not just the ONCD, but during Colonial Pipeline, before this document was written, Ann Neuberger, the most empowered cybersecurity official in history in the White House. She's in the National Security Council for Cyber. She did a ICS sprint, Industrial Control System sprint for the Colonial Pipeline afterwards and said, I want to see some meaningful proposals. I want to see TSA used, do you have authority? Are you using it? Are you using it enough? So there was a real rapid response, which helped inform some of the aggressive posture in this document. And the idea was in Pillar 1, agencies have unused and underused existing authorities, statutory authorities. If you have them, use them. Where you lack them, we will be making joint proposals to the bipartisan bicameral support in Congress to get you new authorities and budgets. And then some really big controversial ideas come in shaping market forces. Pillar 3, like maybe introducing software liability once and for all.
Yeah.
Because too often the cost is placed on the victim or those in the least position to absorb that risk, to identify and or absorb that risk. So every other industry has liability placed on the least cost avoider.
Right.
Everything does except for software. So this is controversial and not likely to happen during this administration, and probably, if I'm a betting man, not likely to happen through Congress. It's probably going to be through the courts. But what the executive branch does with stuff like this is they telegraph their intentions and their strategy, and these are paid attention to by trial lawyers in the court systems or judges, and they're paid attention to by Congress, and they're paid attention to outside of government, insurers, which we're going to talk about later, I assume, and credit rating agencies and other international partners pay attention to these things. So this says what we see, how we see the world, what we think needs to happen. And the intention is where you have existing authorities that are unused or underused, go use them. And earlier versions of this actually specifically called out which ones they knew had unused and underused, and got a little watered down. But you already saw within about a day or two, the Environmental Protection Agency, which is the sector risk management agency for water and wastewater, did pretty much exactly what the White House asked and said, take the CISA cross-sector cyber performance goals as a starting point and use them as a basis for regulation for your sector. So they said, hey, there's an annual survey done for water and wastewater sanitation. During your sanitation survey, assess which of these 39 controls from the CISA cross-sector cyber performance goals are in place. And we'll be smarter, armed with that information, empirical basis, we'll be smarter about future action. So even within a couple of days, EPA, believes they're taking their existing authorities and without mandates, right? They're just trying to say who's doing which things to which extent. So the appropriations and budget and unfunded mandate part that people love to throw around, they have authorities. They haven't not been really used much yet for cyber.
I really like the fact that the document talks about shifting the onus away from the user, because it seems like we've been doing that a lot of victim shaming and a lot of heaving all these security options onto and privacy options onto the user and then blaming them when they don't set them properly or whatever. Why do you think that is? You mentioned, let's go ahead and talk about insurance too and liability. Why do you think it is that this one industry has managed to escape what no other industry has from a legal standpoint of being responsible for these things? And we sign these terms of service and these end user license agreements that we click agree on, sometimes just by cutting open a box with a label on it and absolving these people of this responsibility. Did that industry just grow so fast that the regulations could keep up? How did they manage to escape that? And how are we going to rein that in the future? And then one more to add on with the insurance part. If the government gets it like FEMA sort of thing, we kind of have a FEMA for cyber, where there's these massive incidents and now there's this pool where the government can step in with, unreasonable amounts of money for cyber catastrophes, basically. Is that going to just embolden some of these bad guys to do more things because they might get more money from insurance, and maybe companies to be more lax because, government's got my back, I don't have to try it?
Well, you just identified 3 hours of content for each of those sub-questions.
Sure.
Let me try to give you a terse answer so we can get to the rest of the content. Some reference pointers. A very prescient book that people interested in the questions you asked about, why don't we have cyber insurance, et cetera. Excuse me, not insurance, software liability. It's probably 12 years old now, but it's called Geekonomics, The Real Cost of Insecure Software by David Rice. Beautiful human being who's a fairly senior guy at Apple now, but he helped me write the Rugged Software Manifesto later. We actually bonded by fighting over parts of his book a little bit. But that kind of goes through a lot of the history, and it's multifaceted and multi-layered. But the simple casual answer for someone that's not going to go read that book is we did have provable harm from software flaws. One of the famous ones that's taught to engineering schools and medical schools and complex systems theory schools is from Nancy Levinson's study of the Therac 25 machine, or maybe Therac 35. I'm so tired right now. But there was a radiation delivery machine that had two different ways to administer the dosage of radiation. And one particular pathway could be off by 1 decimal point. Or more decimal points, I think. But you can get 10 times the intended radiation, and it maimed people and it killed people. So we had actual demonstrable harm from software mistakes. there was a big debate at the time, and people can read and study this thing, that software and IT was new. It was a global market. It was the fastest growing part of our GDP. We didn't want to create barriers to entry. What if we make, hurdles and our other countries don't, and all these different, arguments you've heard 1,000 times before, and you're currently hearing about large language model processing, stuff like that. But we decided, okay, we will have to regulate this. We'll have to have accountability, but let's give it 5 years. Well, it's been 35 now. I can't remember what year that was anymore, but it was meant to be a small delay as we got more information. And then things like you've already touched on some of the other complicators, like big unaccountable organizations wanted to codify this. So there were people that manipulated the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act from 1984 to make it harder to be liable. They made shrink wrap contract agreements where you're essentially waiving your rights without even knowing it, without really having a chance to negotiate it. So there's some terms and conditions and things like that. So there's a whole litany of things that have kept it unaccountable for much longer than originally intended. And it's not only is it overdue, markets, I'm not an economist either, but I spent a lot of time with them. In fact, I've done several talks on software liability over the years, and two at RSA alone. One was called Software Liability ? The worst possible idea except for all others. But if you talk to economists, markets want to be efficient, and markets can't be efficient unless you reveal true costs. And you want to put the cost burden on the least cost avoider in the system, which tends to be the upstream producer, because that liberates wasted funds to let them buy more products. And it's highly diseconomic that we don't have liability placed on the least cost avoiders. There's things like Coase's theorem. And, I'm not an economist, but someone that knows economics. Usually when we pull someone in from another discipline, they're like, why haven't you guys done this yet? This is the least economic thing you could do. So there's a moral aspect to it. There's a transparency aspect to it. There's a national security aspect to it. But there's even just this is the most economic thing to do, is identify true costs, place cost burdens on least cost avoiders, which motivates and incentivizes overall cost reduction. So this is going to be a huge food fight. And I've already seen the camps forming. But they're putting big things on the table, because if you always do what you always done, you're always going to get what you always got. And we want to see some changes. We need to make some changes. And at a minimum, the overall theme here is the public-private partnership is imbalanced. We're too deferential to private sector desires at the cost of public goods. So we are going to fix that, and not just in this document, but that was the instruction to the PPD 21 rewrite as well. Just so I don't piss off all your listeners about the liability thing, it says right in there, and needs to say in there, this includes the opportunities for safe harbor. So it's not just let's put liability on people we don't like or rich people. That's how it sounds to some people. No, it's saying this is a shared responsibility between those who produce the infrastructure we try to defend, and it may not be defensible, and those who own and operate that infrastructure, and the victims and the users of those services downstream. And right now, it just by default, all that liability and harm falls to the victims and or the owners and operators. So this is a rebalancing. And if you did everything you could, and some nation state or terrorist group still goes above and beyond that, there should be safe harbor. If you do these reasonable care steps, you should not have infinite liability. So the notion of introducing liability is to put the cost burden on the least cost avoiders and be efficient, but not to have everything fall to people. There should still be safety nets, safe harbors, legal protections when you've done the right things for your part of that shared responsibility ecosystem, and there's still an adverse outcome.
Right. Yeah, there's sort of a food chain there, right? And at some point, you need to kind of go up the food chain to the next person who just has capabilities and to handle something that maybe that the lower levels can't.
Yeah, and this touches on the insurance stuff too. But when I was at CISA, I wrote the CISA.gov/bad practices. There were only 2 at first. Now there's 3 before we left, and I think they're planning to add more. But these are ratified by the insurance industry as, hey, we're going to put this into our underwriting. These are the 3 things that we said were dangerous. So we said the use of unsupported end-of-life operating systems in service of national critical functions and critical infrastructure is dangerous, especially egregious on internet reachable technologies. Anything about hard-coded fixed passwords. So imagine if we try to say from the White House, water and wastewater chemical engineers can't, are negligent if they're using unsupported end-of-life operating systems or they're not using multi-factor authentication. But imagine if the supply chain that sells into them doesn't support multi-factor authentication. So some of it is, are you getting goods that are defensible from your suppliers? And then some of it is, are you doing the things to defend them properly? So that those demarcation points for something like a bad practice involve the Patch Act being necessary for medical devices. The device is sold in the hospital, but now are being looked at with the House and Senate bills on minimum cyber hygiene for hospital operators. So you have to do both. And the part of this strategy acknowledged that finally. And the White House did not specifically task CISA with this, but CISA has put out some publications recently called Safety by Design, Safety by Default, in collaboration with NSA and FBI, but also in collaboration with several allies like Australia and Germany and the UK. So this notion is saying we're going to give cyber performance goals to the owners and operators of critical infrastructure, but we're also going to give guidance on your responsibilities to make products that are safe by design and safe by default.
All right, so you talked about other governments, and this brings up another question I wanted to ask you, and that is, I think it was the UK that said they were going to do this, and that is where the government was actually going to be involved in actively scanning their corporations in the country to look for vulnerabilities, and then responsibly notifying them, hey, you got a problem here, you might want to get this fixed before somebody else finds it, kind of thing. Is that something that we should consider doing? And if to take it to its extreme, I mean, you could white hat hack these things, right? You could have if it was egregious enough, like let's say what was the struts? There was the struts problem. There was a couple of really serious problems that we had recently. Log4j. Yeah, that's what I was thinking of. It was Log4j. Would it ever make sense for the government to actually just actively get in and like, you know what, we got this. You're already hackable. Let me get in there and fix it for you. That's pretty extreme. But what do you think about either the passive scanning and notification or actually actively fixing?
Well, there's a lot packed in there.
As always.
I was at Hack the Capitol last week or 2 weeks ago. It's all blurred to me. And Mark Montgomery from the Cyberspace Clearing Commission gave a talk, and someone asked him this very question about, hey, the UK government scans their citizen infrastructure. Should we do that too? And this is not my answer. This is his answer. But it was something like, you can't do that here. They have the Magna Carta. We have the Constitution. I understand what you're asking for, that we don't have the titles and authorities to do that. And so he just shut it down. Let me give you something in the vicinity answer, although I understood his answer too. We do have opt-in taxpayer pre-funded services from CISA and other places, but let's just stick to the CISA one. So one of them is called CyHy, or cyber hygiene scanning. So if you are part of, quote, designated critical infrastructure as defined by Presidential Policy Directive 21 from the Obama administration, you get free access to a nightly scan of your external IPs and domain that will tell you and email you a report of the known vulnerabilities that we can see on your surface. And so you have to opt into that. We're not actively scanning and sending you emails like we're from the government. We're here to help. But it's but for those who have availed themselves of it, it's instructive, because even if you don't have a big security budget or security team, wouldn't it be nice to know what your attack surface looks like? And then number two, I found that was a lot of noise for someone that was underfunded, someone I called target rich but cyber poor. So I said, look, these organizations that are target rich but cyber poor, 85% of the owners and operators in critical infrastructure in the U.S. have no security staff at all. You can't just give them a laundry list of vulnerabilities and expect them to fix them all. So I was not the only voice doing this, but I helped to get us to publish what's now known as KEV, the Known Exploited Vulnerabilities Catalog. So what I think you know from our last chat, maybe you knew anyhow, in a given year, only about 3% of all CVEs get exploited. That is not an argument to not patch. That's an argument to patch smarter based on which things are most likely to be exploited. And KEV took it a step further. And by the way, to answer the ones that are most likely, one of the coolest projects is called EPSS, or Exploit Probability Scoring System. Some data science was done on these factors strongly positively correlate with eventual exploitation. First.org now maintains that project. So EPSS has always been something I use in my AppSec programs and my PCerts and my incident response stuff, especially because you don't have a CVE yet. So CVSS is wildly inadequate for actual prioritization. Because like I said, only 3% ever get exploited. But CISA was already in collaboration with other agencies looking at known exploited PESENTs, known exploited vulnerabilities. So the KEV catalog is now machine readable and published and added to. So this is a subset of those 3% that have actually hurt a lot of people. And you should pay very close attention. So I think on an opt-in basis, you can get a free vulnerability scan nightly, and you could choose, let's fix the KEV issues, the known exploited ones first. The rest of them can be done later or whenever we have budget and time to do so. But during the pandemic, we couldn't reach all these people and we couldn't sign them up fast enough. So someone pointed out that tools like Shodan and Census.io and even Thingful, I think is one of them, already scan and already know. So could we, if we are aware of these previously scanned things, could we warn people that we've seen exposure? And then also my team published something called SOS, get your, I'm going to use scare quotes, stuff off search, get your poop off Shodan. So I couldn't say that on a government document, but we basically, it was an infographic with a series of instruction books afterwards that said, hey, see what your assets are showing on the internet. See what your adversaries can see. So number one is enumerate what your adversaries can see. Number two is remove the things you don't need. Number three is harden the things you do need. And number four is you should probably do this on a regular basis. So maybe get on those CISA things and Kev routine. So we try to meet people where they are and identify by risk. So we are never going to, I don't think we're likely to do what the UK did and actively scan, but there are passive scanning things that were used during the election security, during the hospital and vaccine supply chain security, which were woven in, and they had different names at the time, but Jack Cable was one of the architects of a lot of that. And he went to Congress for a bit, but he's now back at CISA advancing these programs. So part of the cyber hygiene now, I think, includes the leverage of previously passively scanned things that could be used to help identify and buy down risk in critical infrastructure. But really the goal is to get them, those are the on-ramps to get them into this minimum cyber performance goals. The voluntary crawl stage of the NIST cybersecurity framework is what I like to call it. NIST cybersecurity framework is 400 pages. But the CPGs or the cyber performance goals were meant to be the crawl stage of crawl, walk, run towards doing a more robust program. And then the White House said, hey, well, CISA is not making them mandatory. We want each of your regulators to start with the CPGs and make mandatory minimum hygiene within your current regulatory authorities or ask for new ones where you lack them, which we talked about.
You said that this is basically like the starter document. And there will be documents that follow this, maybe for the various sectors that maybe might not get the same attention. But there were some things that were not explicitly mentioned in this, because there are some very specific things that were called out, but there were some that weren't. And I want to get your take on these and see if these are things that are handled maybe elsewhere or might be coming later. And that, what about the marketplace for Zerodays and things like that, or companies like the NSO Group and their Pegasus product? There are for-profit hacking companies, state level in some cases, or they're selling stuff to state level. And I have to figure that companies like Zeroday, which buys Zerodays, are probably reselling them to companies like NSO Group. Does the White House or does the U.S. government, should they be taking any kind of a more active stance? I know they've said there was something they put out about NSO about putting them on some list. Should we be taking more active role globally to try to say that this is not cool, that we should not be allowing, private marketplace in this kind of area?
Well, again, we could spend an hour unpacking this, and there's some people I might point you to if you do want to spend an hour unpacking this, because I spend quite a bit less time on these offensive zero-day markets and more on defensive and defensibility and aligning incentives for resilience. And, I'm more of a defender than an attacker. Separating the ones that have been sanctioned for doing illegal things or sanctionable things, it's a slippery slope if you're not careful, because like the Zero-Day Initiative, ZDI, or bug bounties, are they going to be on your continuum, right? I mean, people pay money for these. So is it the act of commercializing research and finding?
But the people paying for that is the companies that are looking to get them fixed, right? Eventually, it's not that they're not being sold onto someone else for exploitation. They're being sold to the people who want to get them fixed. That's different, right?
Yeah, there are people that look at this. There's also sometimes it gets into dangerous areas. There's an international agreement called Wassenaar. It looks like Wassenaar, but the W is pronounced V. And smart people are involved and engaged in that. And I can introduce you to them if you like. But but it's an interesting and perilous area. But there's ways to break it down and frame it. But there are markets for these always, whether they're dark markets or or lawful markets and points in between. And it's naive to think that the markets won't exist. The question is, what are the right incentives and carrots and sticks and postures and policies to get the benefits and reduce the risks? So when someone crosses the line, they get sanctioned, or they get added to OFAC, or they, get banned and shunned and things like that. But yeah, what's the Dan Gear quote? All technologies are dual use, right? So these markets exist They exist for the good guys and the bad guys, and they will continue to exist. The question is, how do you govern those markets the best you can?
All right. So in Pillar 2, it talks about actually taking the fight to the bad guys. And I assume we're doing this on some level already. So I'm not sure what this policy document recommends that might be different or novel going forward compared to what we're already doing. But what does that look like? What is it when the government decides to go more, I don't want to say maybe on the offense, maybe that's the wrong way to put it, but how do we go after the bad guys? What does this policy doc recommend that we do to go on the offensive, for lack of a better term?
So relative to pillars 1, 3, and parts of 4, I spent very little time on 2. As I indicated, I'm more of a defense, resilience builder, defender than I am on that. I found pillar 2 to be more saber rattling and chest thumping. We do have a defend forward kind of a inheritance from the previous administrations, and this one seems to be continuing that and calling for collective defense and things like that. And I think if you combine it with parts of Pillar 5, like sometimes the only way we can do this is with international partners who have different rules than we do. So, so it's probably better to read 2 and 5 together than alone, but I did not spend a lot of time on them.
One thing I didn't see in this document, I was actually kind of hoping to see, and again, maybe these are detailed documents that will come later, or these are adjunct things, but I didn't see anything about election security. And it's been such a weird topic because for a long time, folks like us were saying these devices are potentially vulnerable. They're hackable. Look how bad they are. They're running old software. They've got RF interfaces that are easy to get into. And yet, at the end of the day, that hadn't really happened that we could see that it affected any, at least U.S. elections. And so we've got a bunch of people saying, oh, yes, the Dominion machines they're all horrible. They're all hackable. They were hacked. And yet we do need to, states don't have paper ballots, voter verifiable ballots. And so if the machines make a mistake, we'll never know, or hacked, we'll never know. Is that something that has ever brought up in the context of these cybersecurity policy documents?
Earlier, so I think I will answer this. I'll pick an altitude. Part of the reason PPD 21 is old and needs a refresh/rewrite is the world's changed, and the level of hyperconnectivity and dependence on critical, digital infrastructure has changed a lot since the Obama administration. And election security is not its own designated critical infrastructure sector. It's a subsector of government facilities sector. It is pretty important. CISA is only under 5 years old, and both its political appointees, Director Krebs and now Director Easterly, have elevated the importance of their responsibilities for this subsector. It's not even a whole sector, but it's a subsector. They both put significant assistance into election security, integrity, in election ISAC and the multi-state ISACs and things like that. So that is implied. I don't think this strategy gets down to the individual sectors too much. There were earlier drafts where certain sectors were called out as being more critical than others, but for bizarre and infuriating reasons, some of these sectors felt like they should be listed too. They felt left out, and some of them felt like they didn't want to be called out because that might put pressure on them. So as these things go through their fights through the process, significant details were stripped. And maybe that's appropriate, right? And I think because PPD 21 will do a better job making more granular what the sectors are, how new sectors are added. Like there's a big discussion right now, should space be added? And most people in Congress say yes. And then are some of these things too vague or too understaffed or whatnot? So how many sectors should we have? How do you sunset one? How do you add one? How do you properly fund one? Because being named a designated critical infrastructure sector brings with it certain statutory responsibilities. You need a public-private partnership. You need a sector risk management agency. There's duties to CISA. There's duties to the White House. So I think as this got towards the finish line, and it was significantly delayed, like this should have come out a lot sooner than it did. But as it got closer and closer to the finish line, some of those specificities came out. So to maybe give you some heart, because this seems like a concern area for you, CISA did pick its top priorities for the year across those 16 critical infrastructure sectors. One of them was K-12 schools. One of them was healthcare. One of them was energy. And one of them was elections subsector. So even though it's not a sector, she's using her executive discretion to elevate this as one of her top priorities, even above full-fledged critical infrastructure sectors. So it's also as such, it's a priority for subparts of CISA, like the JCDC, the Joint Cyber Defense, Joint Collaborative I can remember JCDC. So boy, do I need some caffeine.
Too many acronyms. I mean, that's just government for you.
Yeah. Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative, I think. But so it's funny. I'm in JCDC and we just say JCDC. So,
right.
So JCDC also has its strategic planning priorities, which is where they interface with private sector entities for collective defense and things like that. So I think different agencies responsible for different parts of critical infrastructure have to act upon this, and one of them, part of the beneficiary of that is elections. I suspect more so after the PPD 21 rewrite.
That's good to hear. That is heartening to hear. And I would, if you got a contact, I would love to talk to somebody about that, because election security is definitely something I like to keep up on. And I've interviewed some folks in the past, but I'd love to talk to somebody else about that.
Even that passive scanning thing I referred to, that was a project that lots of people helped with, but Jack Cable was instrumental, and he's back at CISA now, and that helped use free, census/Shodan type, passive scanning to help warn election facilities. So a lot of those things were born for that election security initiative.
So something like the government's been doing lately, and I mean, TikTok's sort of related to this, but Huawei is maybe a better example, where we're worried about foreign technology. A lot of our stuff is manufactured in China, and obviously in a lot of levels, China is an adversary of ours, a competitor in some other ways, certainly economically. But we're trying to ban some of these foreign products, and some companies are trying to diversify, which I think makes sense for any company to do, but some are outright like leaving China, for other places. And yet I think that, playing devil's advocate a little bit, is there not an argument to be made that almost like mutually assured destruction, if we had these economic and political and manufacturing dependencies on each other, where we couldn't really screw with the other because it would hurt ourselves, should we not be looking more like zero trust kind of things, where I don't care where this thing's from, I'm going to build my system so that I don't trust it. I don't care. It doesn't matter if I don't trust it, as opposed to all pulling back into our own areas and trying to make all of our own stuff.
So without indicating preference, just to be descriptive, the world goes through rhythms, seasons, ebbs and flows. And we were in a globalization mode. And for a multitude of reasons, we are now in a reverse globalization mode. This is even pre-pandemic, geopolitical sometimes, but also just costs, labor, supply chain resilience. The pandemic made it worse, because what we didn't realize is we had done what some would call concentration of risk, right? Put more eggs into fewer baskets. So when there's a disruption in one place, all of us thought we had supply chain resilience and alternative suppliers, but they all pointed back at the same handful. And I personally experienced this during the pandemic, when everyone thought on paper they had plenty of resilient supply for medical goods. And it turned out there was one manufacturer in Malaysia that everyone was pointing to, and when they got disrupted, everybody got disrupted. So, So number one is there's a mega trend of reverse globalization in a lot of areas. But number two, it's because it intersected with, even in the US, there's concentration of risk, right? More eggs in fewer baskets. When JBS meats got hacked, it was I think it's 25% of the meat packing in the country. Right. Really in the world. But I mean, for our dependence, it's about 25%, if I recall. That's material concentration of risk. Through mergers and acquisitions, a lot of the medical supply packaging manufacturers, so that, you have one hack. Americold is a cold chain, cold storage facility all across the US. They got hacked in November 2020, and it affected quite a bit of food spoilage and whatnot. And they just got hacked again like a month ago during RSA or around RSA timeframe. So, those two things have people, even for non-protectionist or non-paranoia reasons, looking to make sure we have local and plural supply chain alternatives and local supply chain. And when it comes to national security, then you want high assurance, foundries and supply chain things. There's a fantastic book as well that is in the water supply even before the pandemic, called Ghost Fleet. It's fictionalized story of the next war. And it was written by August Cole, former journalist, current journalist, and Peter W. Singer. And it's a fantastic read. I mean, it's actually mandatory reading at West Point now, if I recall.
Oh, wow.
It's certainly feeding the notion of the fifth offset and different things about military theory. But for an abundance of reasons, reverse globalization, the exacerbated effects of the pandemic, concentration of risk internationally and domestically, people are onshoring more than they used to and creating more redundancy than they used to. Even climate change issues and weather pattern changes are necessitating that if way too much of a certain crop, like look at the Ukrainian conflict, had a disruption to a certain grain. They made most of that grain for the whole world. When that goes away, everybody goes away. And, you have enough of those and people start to starve, or, economic impact on disproportionately on less wealthy parts of the world. So these things are being recalibrated, some for good reasons, some for bad reasons, but there are a bunch of mega trends. I don't know if I'm even close to answering your question, but then there's obviously if you don't trust or should not trust high assurance mission support for something to be dependent upon for someone from a country you may not trust, or you may have public and or not public reasons not to trust. So I mentioned Dan Gear all the time, and I end up speaking like him in a lot of areas. I like one of the cavalry first principle type things is that we are over dependent on undependable things. And the whole point of that is you should look about proportionality, right? So if it's a low importance thing, don't care. If it's a high importance thing, you do care. So we should have trust and transparency should be proportional to cost of being wrong, right? To cost of consequences. The line I had in the executive order 14028 was, in the end, the trust we place in our digital infrastructure should be proportional to how trustworthy and transparent that infrastructure is, and to the consequences we will incur if that trust is misplaced. So that's how I think. That's how Dan Gear thinks. And I don't think it's xenophobic per se to say that for something like our most secret, national security-ish thing should have higher standards of care.
Sure, yeah.
And some of these things, even if you could get source code and things like that, are you going to really spot it off by one? There was a great line in a book, Rootkits Revealed, by Butler and Hoagland, that said, what's the difference between a backdoor and a deliberate off by one coding error? And
nothing.
But I actually asked that to someone at Fort Meade once, and he said plausible deniability, because you can at least see the backdoor. And I'm like, it's beautiful, right? You think about it.
Yeah.
So, no, I think for certain things where the cost of wrong is too high, you shouldn't take elective risk. But that's a sliding scale, and people can take it too far. I think I don't want to get into TikTok discussion, but I think most of the rhetorical bits around TikTok are missing the actual real concerns of TikTok. And they're more like, they don't let their own citizens use the version we have for a reason. So it's less about stealing things, which is a red herring, or, a lot of these are global companies anyhow. And a lot of the risks that they're flagged in TikTok are also present in onshore, which is why I'm equally circumspect of lots of onshore social media things. But generally speaking, we're going to have a risk tolerance for good and for bad reasons that is also sitting in a sea of these macro trends, mega trends.
Since most of my audience is probably not in government, probably not running infrastructure companies, let me back way up and just ask, from somebody who's into resilience, what advice do you give to your friends and family who ask you, what are some of the simple things I can do to be more cyber resilient? What kind of products should I buy or avoid buying? How do I avoid being the weakest link or the slowest antelope kind of thing? Should I, as just a regular old consumer, how much should I be thinking about redundancy and backup systems, like having a generator or things like that? What are some good Boy Scout, always be prepared kind of things you might recommend for people?
I think it's very hard to actually protect yourself right now. And I think a lot of my advocacy and work in I Am the Cavalry and rugged software before that, and some of these public policy things I work on, it's to make it easier for the average citizen to just trust things and have them be trustworthy. And that's not the case right now. We're very, very far from that. I mean, you might find some themes in the recent CISA publication I mentioned, safety by design, safety by default. It's not perfect. It's superficial. And it's kind of like someone asked me if it was the Josh Corman greatest hits. I didn't invent all of them, but I mean, I've certainly been advocating for a lot of those things. So I was surprised to see that published well after I left. But some of the driving forces behind that are two really smart guys, Bob Lord and Jack Cable, are helping drive a lot of that content. But I would say, look, if it's we have a lot of elective attack surface. Like not everything needs a microphone to capture and transmit your voice, and not everything needs a camera to capture and transmit your image, and not every device should be smart. Smart things are dumb, right? Generally speaking, like there's a cost to connectivity. You're exposing, anytime you have the ability to capture and transmit voice or information about yourself or image, you're exposing yourselves to accidents and adversaries. You're hoping the manufacturer did everything to care about your privacy as much as you did. You're hoping they did a good job executing it, because even if they do care about it as much as you do, they can get it wrong. And it is just the velocity with which adversaries find and exploit things is much faster than the velocity with which we identify and remove those flaws. So if you don't need a microphone and a camera on everything in your house, don't do it. And if you have to buy things that are connected and exposed, in fact, I did a TED Talk about this 10 years ago. It was called Swimming with Sharks. And I should watch it again. I'm probably going to cringe at how different I look now. But it was pretty much on the money if we're trying to talk to my neighbors or my family and whatnot. But when you add software to something, you make it hackable. And when you connect it to other things, you make it exposed. So the Internet of Things is, we're exposed to every apex predator, every accident adversary, and we don't have to be. So I think the most prudent thing is, if you don't need to depend on it, don't. And if you do need to depend upon it, like seek things that are patchable, right? You can't be both hackable and unpatchable. It's unsafe at any speed.
Right.
Get things that are patchable and have a commitment to how much the patching there will be. Part of the strategy is to have labeling and signaling to market so that you buy things you need. I've been a big advocate for 10 years on software bill of materials, SBOM. That's been, matriculating. It shows up in here again. And there's still a lot of opponents to transparency, which should, anytime someone's arguing against transparency, it should raise your hackles. But
yes.
But, I'm still in the fight. We're still sort of winning the fight, but we still have quite a bit of adversarial pushback on transparency. Some people are very afraid of that for the software you have, right? So I basically say, if you look at the Patch Act, maybe this is how I'll tie this off. The Patch Act is a proxy for what could happen elsewhere. Patch Act was just for medical devices, but it said, look, we're going to regulate that you're patchable. We're going to regulate that you have a threat model that you submit. Maybe experts won't know how to read, non-experts won't know how to read a threat model, but we want to know that you've put some thought into least privilege and, privilege escalation and lateral movement and what's the worst that could happen, and contain, isolate, compromise. Number 3, we want you to have a machine-generated, machine-readable software bill of materials, so you know what's in it. So that if there's a Log4j, you can tell, am I affected and where am I affected in seconds, instead of just waiting to get hit. And there's a bunch of other stuff in there, but you could imagine a consumer version of this, and I'm aware of initiatives to help on labeling requirements and first principles for this. And I believe this is one of the things you'll see come in implementation plans from the White House, at least guidance, not necessarily regulation. But, what does this look like? Can it be internationally harmonized? There's some things happening in Europe, in Singapore, in Japan, elsewhere as well. So this SBOM thing seems to be taking root internationally. And some of these things like being patchable, I would say a leader here is go look at the UK Code of Practice. The UK government did pass it in a law eventually, but this is for consumer IoT. You must be patchable. You should avoid hard-coded passwords. You should have a coordinated vulnerability disclosure program so that good faith researchers can bring you flaws without fear of legal reprisal, things like that. You should encrypt data at rest and in transit. Really simple basics. And I think number 1 is don't have a connected thing if it doesn't need to be a connected thing. Number 2 is try to make sure that if you're going to buy some, that they're patchable and they have a good security program and a good reputation. And number 3, make sure you're vigilant to make sure you're applying those patches when they're available. But when it comes to generators and things like that you're asking about, I think I just have a very simple engineering perspective. All systems fail. You should be prepared to handle failure. So the Cavalry frameworks for a lot of these regulatory things were you should avoid failure by safety by design. You should take help avoiding failure without suing the helper with coordinated disclosure programs. You should capture, study, and learn from failure by having tamper-evident, forensically sound evidence capture or logging. You should fail safely or separate critical systems from non-critical systems. And you should have a prompt and agile response to failure. So avoid failure, take help avoiding failure, capture and learn from failure, contain and isolate failure, and respond to not prevent future failure. And if devices can't handle those basic 5 primitives, then we're in a bad way. There was also an IoT Cybersecurity Improvement Act that we passed in the law. The initial bill was much better than the final bill, but special interests and lobbyists again. But that the UK Code of Practice, I think these are going to end up being mandatory labeling. It probably will not be on the box that you buy or on the website, but you may have a way to look up their security posture through like a QR code or some sort of universal landing spot. But I think people are starting to realize that as we become more dependent on digital infrastructure, it has to be more dependable. And hopefully there'll be more conscientious purchasers.
All right, man. One more question before I let you go. I know it was just released in March, but by any chance, has there been any noticeable changes as a result of this policy document being released, or something else put in motion because of this document? And then as citizens, as we're monitoring this, what do we expect next? How do we, because, maybe the first one didn't make like national news, I don't think. Maybe it did. But I mean, I don't know that the follow-ups are going to make national news or the follow-on stories. How do we pay attention to what is going to be happening and keep track of our progress of this document? Yeah,
people kept saying, well, when's the implementation plan coming? And that's kind of a malformed question. It's some of these things that they telegraphed were already in flight and public and published when they published the overall umbrella.
Okay.
Some of them are coming. Think of it more like a rolling thunder, right? So this is the overarching strategy and elements. And as things come out, they'll be tethered to, pillars or sub-pillars. I know if you watch their speeches right now, the initial ONC director was Chris Ingles. He retired. So the acting director is Kemba. If you watch Kemba's remarks, Kemba's been talking about workforce a lot. So I would anticipate more detail on workforce and cyber citizenry soon. At RSA conference just a couple weeks ago, CISA, in support of this, published their Safety by Design, Safety by Default publication. They also put out some SBOM guidance with the Department of Energy. They also put out draft attestation forms for Executive Order 14028 for things like that. That was the response to SolarWinds. So the matriculation of Executive Order 14028 is in Pillar 2. Not Pillar 2, it's in one of the pillars. I think it's either Pillar 1 or 3. But not only do they want to finish that, they want to add to it. So these things that are coming out may not have a blinking light saying, hey, we're part of Pillar 3, but they are being executed prioritized and executed and published because they're in this strategy. If I were a betting man, since we're nearing Hacker Summer Camp, I would expect some fire to be held for publication around Hacker Summer Camp.
Okay.
I think we'll have some intermediate things because we've seen people whispering about it, but I think some of the bigger publications would be there. I'm not professing inside baseball. I'm just watching when these things come out. Some things came out during RSA. Some more things will probably come out during Black Hat DEF CON. Oh, the AI stuff, by the way. Arguably, that was part of the investment in the future. So the recent AI meetings.
Which recent AI meetings?
I'm trying to remember what they called them, but they had...
Because AI has been all over the news.
Vice President Harris convened AI thing weeks ago.
Yeah, so they brought in a bunch of people to testify, right?
That too. And there was a testimony yesterday that's unrelated, or maybe a follow-on. But DEF CON policies announced an AI village. So
yes, I did see that.
All these are connected. So the White House, telegraphing this AI hacking village, or I can't remember what they're calling it. But these are under the banner of Pillar 4. So whether they are good at advertising these things we're doing conform to the strategy, they do conform to the strategy. And also on Pillar 3, the whole shaping market forces, a bunch of lawyers and legal scholars got together to talk about the state of liability assumptions, fact and fiction, at the federal and at the state level. So those conversations are happening as well.
Well, it's good. I mean, it's good to see, honestly, just that this stuff is actually getting worked on, because I felt like maybe I just wasn't as tuned in years ago, but it seems like there's been a lot more flurry of activity in recent years around these things. And maybe it's just because it's coming to a fore. There's just been so many ransomware attacks and so many other things pushing this stuff along. Maybe we're just finally responding, but it's good to see we're doing it. And I'm glad to see the document. I'm glad we have people like you out there helping to put together these kind of documents. So anyway, Josh, thanks for coming on and answering all the questions.
No worries.
So there were so many questions I didn't get to. So many things I wanted to talk to Josh about. My list of questions was really long. I knew it was going to be too long. Obviously, I'd saved. So some of these questions actually bled over into some patron-only content. On Patreon, I have a special private podcast where I do some special things. And on the interview shows, on those weeks, I capture, extra questions with the guest. Often it's stuff that's not related directly to what we talked about on the show, just to kind of keep it, tangential. But in this case, there were definitely some questions I didn't get to that I had to ask later. I got like almost another half hour's worth of interview content with Josh. And one of the really interesting things we talked about was what they call a tabletop exercise. And this is where you kind of do a war game scenario where let's pretend something bad happens. Let's go through it. Let's see how we react to this. Okay. So I'm going to tell you right now that your medical electronic record system at this hospital has been taken down. The ransomware has made it completely unavailable. What do you do? And this is something they actually did with the hospital, and they found out right away that it brought them to their knees, because while they had paper backup systems that we used for decades prior to having electronic records, nobody knew how to use them. So anyway, we talk about some of that stuff in the bonus content. Josh talked about a lot of things. I've put as many links to the most important ones as possible in the show notes. So, the White House Strategy Guide, obviously. Josh mentioned his blog article called Consequential Cybersecurity, which is kind of his take on the main pillars in the White House Strategy Guide. Obviously, links to I Am the Cavalry if you're interested in that. He talked about his Swimming with the Sharks TED Talk. I haven't watched it all yet. I've started watching it. It looks great. There's a link in the show notes for that. And many other things, the PPD 21 document and all these things that we kind of mentioned, I try to throw into the show notes. But I think we really need to be looking at this stuff in a different light. I mean, think back to like World War II and probably World War I as well, where they had campaigns like, loose lips sink ships and turn your lights off at night and collecting medals for the war effort and things like that. I mean, it's not quite that bad, but I mean, I think we do need to kind of think about personal security, your personal security, like not just as a business, but like you listening to this podcast right now, your personal security, it's part of your kind of patriotic or at least civic duty to make sure that you're being secure, because like I like to say, security is a we thing, not a me thing. If you're less secure, we're all less secure. And so that's why I made those coupons. That's one of the reasons I made those coupons. If you go to fdsd.me/coupons, you'll find that article. And my latest effort where I want to recognize people who are doing good deeds. And for those people who really go above and beyond, I would like to, recognize that effort. And to that end, I'm going to be giving away some of my really cool Dragon Challenge coins to people. And the way you get nominated for one of those things is you submit something at fdsd.me/quest. That'll tell you all the information you need. So Josh, as you know, was one of the founding members of I Am the Cavalry. And it is just this year hitting its 10-year anniversary. In fact, I think it was announced at B-Sides and DEF CON exactly 10 years ago. So that's, going to be August coming up here. I think Josh said he's going to be giving a keynote about this at the B-Sides Las Vegas, and I'm hoping to see that while I'm there. And I'm absolutely looking forward to that. So anyway, I hope you really enjoyed that interview. I know I certainly did. Josh is such an interesting guy. Hopefully we can bring him back periodically. I've got a great interview next time with Ernesto Falcone. That'll be in 2 weeks. And I'm working on some really cool interviews coming up after that. So if you haven't, obviously subscribe. That way you won't miss any of this. Tell your friends, tell your families, spread this around on social media. Really great stuff coming up. Not sure exactly what I'm going to be doing yet for DEF CON this year in terms of for the podcast content for you guys, but I will definitely be bringing back reports from DEF CON. I will capture some audio there, maybe do some interviews while I'm there again, like I did in the past. I don't know if I'm going to be talking to Jeff Moss again this year, but I do have some interesting things in the works. So again, subscribe. That way you won't miss it. If you want to be a patron, if you want to get some of this great bonus content and join our discussions on Discord, we got a great community growing there. You can go to patreon.com and look for Firewalls Don't Stop Dragons. Or if you go to my website, firewallsdon'tstopdragons.com, and go to the support tab, you can find all the information there as well. With DEF CON and Black Hat and B-Sides coming up, I will be there in Vegas. I will be going certainly to DEF CON and a little bit of B-Sides, maybe a little bit of Black Hat. You might want to get some Firewalls Don't Stop Dragons swag. Be sporting a t-shirt or a hoodie or baseball cap or something. I got all sorts of stuff if you're interested. Just go to fdsd.me/merch, and that will take you right to the shop. All right, everybody, take care. Stay safe out there, and until next week, as always, don't get caught with your drawbridge down.